Alright, this will be the collaboration between me and Alura Cein. I will put her channel in the description box down below. I'll also try to link a couple of her videos, recent true life spooky tales videos, in the card somewhere up here. When I'm editing, you'll see it later. And go ahead and subscribe to her channel. You can subscribe to this channel, hear her talk about all things spiritual, positive, lots of different stuff that you don't hear a lot of people talk about. And if you want books and things and writing updates and stuff going on over here and a fair amount of weirdness, come on over here too. So, I'm tired, sorry. And I'm also pressed for time, so. This is going to be a true story. I will also link a video by another friend of mine, Toby, somewhere down here and up here, because we're all getting together this spooky season to tell true tales, not fictitious tales, but actual real life stories that have happened to us. So the story that I'm going to tell is, hopefully this won't be as convoluted as it is in my head, because this took place over a series of months and years, quite a while ago now, and it was experienced by two other members of my family. And I recently had a conversation, like a current, more adult rerun of this conversation, of this story, in a conversation with my mother that I had with my mother over the weekend, to refresh my memory of some of the details and also ask her about some of the things that she remembers taking place in this house that we previously lived in. And I'm glad I did, because I did mention this in a video clip that I sent to Alura, that where I touched on this story somewhat, but I'm going to go into more detail here, as well as add some things that I'd forgotten but my mother remembered. This took place, I'm not going to say where the house is, because as far as I am aware, the house does still exist, and presumably there are still people living there. So, some years ago, my parents, this was before I came of age, my parents and I moved into a ranch style house that was in the process of being renovated. Well, remodeled, actually. They were doing some pretty extensive remodeling. And I'll describe the house as the story goes on, because the placement of certain features is going to be significant. We originally saw the house when it was still being worked on, and it looked really nice. They were doing a really good job. But at the time, one of the things that they had not yet completed was the basement. Now, at the time that I mentioned this story to Alura, I did not recall that this house had a basement. I was positive that it didn't. It wasn't until I had rehashed all this with my mother that I recalled actually there was a basement. But the reason that I didn't recall it was because I was hardly ever down there. They were supposed, the people who were working on this house were supposed to finish the basement. There was supposed to be a whole other room down there. But we moved in, and they said, because we had to move in by a certain date, because our time at the previous house, which was also a ranch, interestingly, was up. And initially, at the time that we had seen the house, they were in the process of working on the basement, and doing repairs. But at the time, there was just a ladder because they had taken the stairs out. They were going to build new stairs for it, which they did. But they never completed it, which made us feel not so great because we wanted to be able to use that space for other things and never could. Things besides storage, and we never could. So we moved in, and I'm not sure exactly when the first strange things happened because, well, actually, no, I take that back. I do know when the first it wasn't something odd that happened, but it was an odd feature of the house. The house, like I said, was a ranch style. So everything was on one level, everything but the basement, obviously. And the backyard, well, the back of the house, let's start with the back of the house. The original design of the house had a patio, but they converted the patio to a room, a closed-in room, and the back of the house, therefore, was almost nothing but windows. You had just a wall of windows across the back of the house, and then a door that led to a stone terrace, I suppose you could say. That was now the actual patio. And that led to the backyard. And the backyard sloped down away from the house. And the very bottom of the yard, because it was a fairly long yard, had a tree line so the water could run off. And in this particular area, we had deer who would come up into the yard and eat the plants and nuts and berries and everything. And then on the left side, if you were walking out the back door, the left side of the yard had a chain fence, and on the chain fence, well, for half of the chain fence, approximately half of the chain fence, there was honeysuckle growing on the fence. And then you had various vines and, wild plants growing along the rest of it. And on the opposite side of that fence, you had houses that faced the opposite street, because we were here, the street that we were on ran this way and then turned to the right, and there were houses up here. These houses were on a hill, we were on a hill, but because we faced this way and they faced this way, when we went out the back door, we could see into all their yards, because they were elevated and we were elevated too, but we were cornered. We were around the corner. So I remember when we were looking at the house, my mother at the time, it wasn't that she necessarily had trouble walking, but she didn't like walking on very uneven surfaces. And the backyard, she almost never went into the backyard. I think she only ever, in the time that we lived in that house, she only went into the backyard and walked around back there once, maybe twice, because it was so lumpy and bumpy that at the time she was really concerned that she was going to sprain her foot or her ankle or something like that. I, on the other hand, was out there a lot more regularly, and my father would go out there and cut the grass. But at the time that we first saw the house, one of the things that we noticed when we went out into the back was that there was a pipe in the backyard, right in the middle of the backyard. And by a pipe in the backyard, I don't mean a pipe connected to something. I mean a pipe sticking up out of the ground with nothing around it. A pipe that was apparently not connected to anything in the house. It wasn't connected to anything associated with the house. And the pipe had dirt in it. It wasn't completely full, but there was, topsoil in it. According to my recollection, we were told never to mess with the pipe. It was just left there, which was why we didn't mess with it. It was very odd because they were remodeling the house, and under other circumstances, I think we would have assumed that this was just some debris that was left over. But the pipes was physically stuck in the ground as if somebody had actually planted it there. And the whole time that we lived there, we didn't mess with it because we were told not to. Now, my mother didn't really remember that part, but just like I don't really remember the basement because I never bothered going down there, she doesn't really recall that much about the backyard because she never went out there. So I remember more about the backyard. She remembered more about the basement and the interior of the house. So, pipe in the backyard, slightly odd, but not a deal breaker. So we went ahead and moved in. And the finishing touches on the house were completed right around the same time that we moved in. Because everything was on one level, we didn't have a second floor. And the basement was not usable in the way that we wanted it to be usable. You didn't have to go very far in the house for anything. The kitchen was in the center. You had a front room with a nice window that got a lot of sun. And then you walked from the front room into the kitchen in the center of the house. On this side, you had the entrance to the basement, as far as I can recall. Next to that, you had a small room that had the hookups for computer, internet, and all that. And then from that small room, there was a door that led to the garage. On the opposite side of the kitchen, you had a hallway, door to the bathroom, door to my room, door to my parents' room, and then one of the things they added to my parents' room was an in-room bath. It wasn't a full bath. I think it was just a half bath, but it was a convenience that they really liked. So when we moved in, and then of course from the kitchen you had several steps that went down to what used to be the patio, but was now a sunken TV room, back room. And that was actually where we had our TV, where we watched movies, had our couch. And at the time, I had my cat, Nora. My cat, Nora, was still alive. And she was still relatively young, pretty young. And then the back of the house, like I said, because they had converted a porch into a room, the back wall was all windows. And then you had the door to the new, well, it wasn't new, the stone patio, and then the yard. So when you were in the back and the blinds were open, you could see everything that was going on in the yard. And if you were on the far side of the room, you could see into the neighbor's yard. And while we lived in that house, things got a little bit weird. Not just in the potentially paranormal sense either. There were other weird things that took place that I'll get into. One of the first things that I think we noticed after the pipe was that, first of all, nobody else had a pipe. What made us so special that we had a pipe? Why were we the only ones who got that? The fact that it seemed like we weren't supposed to mess with it, and the pipe did go down. It seemed to go down further than we thought. We thought it was just like maybe a couple inches. But I seem to remember my father giving it a tug. I know I did. I'm pretty sure I did. Because I'm me. I'm me. I wanted to see what that was. I like mystery. I wanted to see what was so interesting about this pipe. And there was no way that either of us could get it out. it was really stuck down in there, and it gave the impression that it was longer than it was, because it was so fat, it was so stuck fast in the dirt. There was no way you could just give it a tug and it would come up, because it didn't look like the pipe was that big. It wasn't that, didn't seem that high. But there was no way that we were going to be able to get it out, and we just left it and mowed around it. So one of the things that happened, and this was in no specific order, but I'll start with the weird things that happened in the house. My father, sometime after we moved in, one morning, I think, he said that he had heard voices coming out of the vents, coming out of the air vents in the bedroom. And of course, that made him want to get up and see what was going on. There was no exterior entrance to the basement, again, because it wasn't finished. I don't recall there being any, and in the conversations that I've had with my mother, no exterior entrance. And of course, he went looking around to see who was doing all this talking. There was nobody there. Nobody was awake. It was the middle of the night, as far as I recall, because he was laying in bed, asleep, or trying to go to sleep, and he heard these voices coming out of the vent, muffled, human voices. No way of telling exactly what they said because they were too far away, but there was the distinct sound of conversation coming out of the vents. There was nobody in the basement, nobody in the house. There were no radios playing. The TV wasn't playing. I'm not even sure we had... I'm pretty sure we didn't have cable at the time. For most of my life, we didn't. Didn't bother. So, in the morning, he told my mother about it, and I heard him mention that. She had not heard anything, and I hadn't heard anything because I was sound asleep. But then later on, we did hear things coming out of the vents. We did hear conversations coming out of the vents, and we heard them during the day when we were awake, or in the evening when we were awake. And he said, "That's what I heard. You hear it? That's what I heard." And we went, "Yeah, where's that coming from? It can't be coming from the basement because there's nobody down there. We don't have a radio playing. There aren't any sounds coming out of the computer because the computer was in a different room. It wasn't in the basement. It was in a different room on the main floor. It was turned off. And it wasn't sounds coming from the movie that we were watching because they were coming out of the vent. And when you stop the film, the sounds are still coming out of the vent." So sometimes they were really, really faint. Other times they were louder, but you could never tell exactly what was being said. These same sounds, and this was something that I didn't remember but my mother did because my father told her about it, was that he had gone out into the backyard and heard those same voices in conversation coming out of that pipe, sticking up out of the ground. And again, he couldn't tell exactly what was being said, but that's not something that you hear about every day. And that was odd. And we couldn't figure out why, how sound could possibly travel from wherever it was traveling from, underground, through the basement, despite the fact that there was nobody down there, up the vent and still be distinct enough for us to be able to tell that there was a conversation going on. Another thing that would happen inside the house was that we started hearing what could only be described as a train running underground. There was a rumbling sound that was like the sound of a train traveling along tracks, except it was underground. Except it was underground, and there were no railroads in the vicinity of the house. And even if there had been, the sound would have been above ground, not below ground. And when we heard these train sounds, what I call the train sounds, very often you could feel the vibration in the house. You could feel the vibration come up through the floor as if somebody was actually running some kind of a train underground. I don't recall if we were ever able to catch that sound coming out of the pipe, but the conversation sounds, yes. The conversation sounds, yes, we caught that coming out of the pipe. Now, of course, back then, we were not even sort of kind of thinking along the lines of, oh, let's record this. I think most people, when they experience something weird, generally speaking, more often than not, contrary to popular opinion and what you might see online a lot of times, most people, I don't think, actually stop to take out whatever device they got on hand and try to record it. Most of the time, you're too busy having the experience and trying to figure out, what the heck? Am I the crazy one, or is this some kind of an illusion? And who am I going to tell about it? Probably no one, because they're going to look at me like I'm weird. So we had voices coming out of the vents and the pipe, train sounds coming out of the vents that actually caused a vibration in the house that we could feel coming up through the floor. And then we had something, how should I put it, more suspiciously terrestrial going on. One evening, and I remember this very clearly because it was so startling. It had to have been the evening because my father was home from work and we were sitting down eating, I'm pretty sure. And or possibly on the weekend during the afternoon, but whenever it was, my father was definitely home. Yeah, it was during the day. He and my mother and I were all in the TV room. That's what I call the converted porch with the wall of windows. And we were sitting down, presumably having snacks, watching a movie, just enjoying family time. And all of a sudden, we hear the very distinct sound of a helicopter, which in itself is not strange, except for the sound that the helicopter was making. And the fact that the helicopter was flying, shall we say, a little low, way too low. Helicopters are not supposed to fly this low. We heard it all of a sudden very close, and we heard it, we could tell it was like it was descending. It wasn't just flying, it was descending. It was very close to the house, and it made a very distinct sound. And my father, because of his past history, immediately jumped up and said, "That's military," and went all the way to the front of the room to try to look out the window and see what was going on, because this helicopter made the sound of a military helicopter. Now, even if you've never heard them in real life, you only heard them in the movies, you know, military helicopters do not sound like your standard helicopter because they have those metal blades. So they make a very distinct metallic type of whirring sound. They beat the air in a way that's different from, let's say, a helicopter that would be used by the police or by the news media or whoever. They don't have those blades. Those are specific to military. And he looked out the window and he couldn't see anything, of course, because at this point, whoever was flying this helicopter, they really needed to have their license taken away, because they hovered over the house, number one, which you don't do. Number two, they hovered so low that it was vibrating the air and the windows in the house and the dishes in the cabinet. Everything was vibrating. That's how low this thing was. Everything was starting to make this little tinkling sound and this little trembling movement that you could feel in the air. And I remember my mother got up and said, "Don't go out there, you crazy. If they want to say something, they gotta come in here." And we just kind of stood there looking up at the ceiling, waiting to see if we were going to hear boots hit the roof, because we were expecting that. Because generally, if somebody hovers over your roof like that, either you're getting airlifted, or I don't know, we're about to be bombed or something. I don't know, because we never got an answer to why this was happening, and it didn't just happen once, didn't just happen twice. Didn't just happen thrice. Didn't just happen that's not a word. This happened repeatedly over the course of time that we lived in this house. It would happen, again, as far as I recall, strictly during the day. Not necessarily at a set time of day. Not necessarily even on certain days. Not even at certain times of the year. But it did happen, as far as I can recall, strictly during the day. Even if we had been, I know you can say, well, maybe you're just in a flight path. If that's ain't nobody who flies a helicopter or knows anything about helicopters is gonna hover that close to trees and power lines. No. But what do I know? I don't even have a college education, so what do I know? Maybe helicopters and power lines do mix. And even if there hadn't been trees around, even if there hadn't been power lines, even if it hadn't been a perfectly ordinary, run-of-the-mill residential area, who in their right minds repeatedly hovers over somebody's roof? In a military helicopter, or what sounds like a military helicopter, because why else would they have those blades? Who repeatedly does that for no good reason? It didn't make any sense. And we've never gotten an answer to really any of the things that happened in this house. So since now we're starting to talk about things that happened outside the house, Now I'm going to start talking about a couple of things that I, in particular, saw outside of the house. Um, as I mentioned earlier, the backyard had a downward slope to it, and there was a tree line at the base, at the bottom of the property line. On one particular day, both of these incidences happened when I was in the TV room at the back of the house. Both of these happened during the day. Both of them happened when I was by myself in that room, and both of them happened when there was pretty good amount of sun, and the blinds were open, windows were clear. One particular time, I just happened to be looking out the back windows, probably checking to see if I could see any of the deer, because as I said before, deer would sometimes come into the backyard and graze. And on this particular time, during this particular time, I did see something, but it was not a deer. I looked down towards the tree line and I saw movement. And initially I thought that 5, 6, 8 something teenage boys had climbed over the chain fence and gotten into the shrubbery back there and were doing something, because I saw these human figures, slim, not too tall, not too short, average height, dark, moving around, going through the brush, walking back and forth. So that was why I thought initially, my mind immediately went, oh, there must be some teenage boys in the neighborhood, and for some reason they presumably are trespassing, because we didn't actually own that portion of the land, but then neither did they. And they got back in there and they're, I don't know, fooling around doing something, possibly something that they're not supposed to be doing. But then I realized that these figures were not moving in a way that made sense to me. I also noticed that I could not see any facial features. They were completely black. Human, but they were like black, animated, lanky gingerbread cookies, for lack of a better way of putting it. That was the only way that I could think of to describe it at the time, because they had no facial features whatsoever. They were presumably clothed, but you couldn't see the outlines of any clothes, like sleeves, the line where your shirt ends and your pants begin, where the cuffs are, and if I would have, because there was some of the shrubbery was really overgrown, but sometimes when you lift your feet up and you're climbing over stuff, you should have been able to see feet, you should have been able to see shoes, and I didn't see anything. I also noticed that these figures sometimes were moving almost like they were gliding, but they were also walking and gliding at the same time, sometimes doing more of one than the other. They were constantly walking back and forth. Sometimes the same figure would constantly walk back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I caught several of these figures walking behind a tree. Let's see, this is the tree. They walk behind the tree, and then I would wait, but they would never come out the other side. And I would see them apparently talking to each other, because they would be gesturing, like so, and they would be looking around, and their arms would move like they were parting some of the brush, but I couldn't really tell if the brush was moving or not, which was also odd. And this movement continued for, it's hard to say exactly how long. Maybe, I'm going to be really conservative and say 8-10 seconds, and then just gone. I didn't see him leave. I didn't see him walk out. I didn't see him climb out. I didn't see him run away. I didn't see him climb back over the fence. To be fair, I hadn't seen him climb over the fence in the first place, so I'm not exactly sure where they came from. They were just there, and as I was watching them, they just disappeared. Some of them disappeared by actually going behind a tree and not coming out the other side. But others, because they were all moving, and sometimes they would move really, really fast, sometimes slower, sometimes faster. Some of them just seemed to disappear into thin air, whereas others seemed to actually disappear behind something. So I can't say that all of them disappeared behind something or into something, because sometimes it was hard to track their movement. And the fact that they were completely black, which I tried initially to reason was, well, maybe they're just wearing completely black clothes. But if that's the case, then that's slightly weird too, because I can't see anything of their faces, and I should have been able to see their faces. Couldn't even see their eyes. They had nothing at all. The outline of a head, that's why I compare it to an undecorated gingerbread man. You see a head, but everything is blank. And so that, I remember the first day that that happened. And then similar incidences happened on other occasions. There would be different numbers of them each time, though. Sometimes it was only 2 or 3. On 1 or 2 occasions, I was only able to see 1. On other occasions, there were multiples, more like 5. But in other instances, it was just maybe 3, 1, 2. Some would appear first, and then others would appear a little later, and then again, everybody would pretty much disappear at the same time, presumably, because they were all black, all identical, and I couldn't really tell one from the other, unless I really tried to focus on one and follow where it moved. And then the second thing that happened was, again, I was in the back room, again, during the day, broad daylight. I don't recall exactly what I was doing, but I remember that I was on the right, further on the right side of the room as opposed to the left. So because I was on the right side, I was able to, if I chose to look out the window, I could see the backyards, the other backyards of the houses on the other street. And while I was preoccupied with whatever I was preoccupied with, I heard a sound that I've only ever been able to describe as a combination of a roar mixed with a trumpet, as in a playing trumpet, or possibly even the trumpeting of an elephant, but some a sound similar to that, but combined with a roar, so that the two, you can't really tell where one ends and the other begins. And this sound was, the only way I can describe it is that it was more like pure sound. Not a sound that you hear with your ears, but the actual sound wave that you feel hit you and go through you and makes you jump. But you can also hear it, but at the same time, it's so loud, but yet so silent that you hear it in your head as well as feel it in the air. So I jumped and immediately looked. What made me look? in that particular direction out the window, I'm not sure. I have no idea why I looked that way. I just knew that that was the place to look. So when I looked out the window, and I also got up and started walking more towards the center of the room, I saw this. I'm going to try to describe it, but it's the words are not 100% accurate. I would say on average, approximately 8 foot tall, transparent yet somehow glassy, for lack of a better way of putting it, man. And I say man because it looked and felt like a man. A good 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, muscle-bound, like all get out. Not completely naked, but maybe half naked, like from the waist up. And he was walking with long strides, apparently from one of the yards of the other houses on that cross street. And he walked straight through the metal fence into our yard, looking over, and turned his head and looked back over his shoulder. So he turned his head to look over his right shoulder. Almost, I got the impression at the time, almost like he thought there was somebody over there, or maybe like he was being followed. And he was moving he wasn't running, and he wasn't really rushing, but he was moving. And he looked over his shoulder, and because he was looking over his right shoulder, I was able to see that, it was a human face. And then he didn't see me. I'm not even sure that he was aware of the house, but because he walked right through the metal fence. But he walked halfway across the yard, and when he got almost level with that pipe, not with the pipe itself, but it was in the center of the yard, so you could draw a line down the yard. When he got almost level with that line, he disappeared, almost like he had walked through a door that wasn't there. Now, I have, in the past, not so much recently, but in the past, because we haven't talked about this in a long time, I've previously tried to come up with some type of image that was similar to what I saw. Now, with the black figures, that's actually really easy. I've seen multiple drawings by different people, different kind of artwork that depicts things that look basically the same as those black figures that I saw. I'm not saying that they're actually meant to depict the same type, but pretty much it's not an uncommon image. I'm sure a lot of people who have any knowledge of any kinds of hauntings or suspected hauntings of particularly more negative type of thing. Not saying they were necessarily negative. I can't say with 100% certainty that they were or they weren't. But I'm sure a lot of people have seen and heard stories similar to that. As far as I am aware, that's not a particularly uncommon thing. I can't really find anything, and, well, I might be able to now, but I don't really want to bother looking. At the time, I couldn't really come up with any image that was similar enough to what I saw of the giant, and I just refer to him as the giant. With the exception, however, of some of the artwork that I used to see that was meant to represent the giants of Genesis 6, which interestingly was actually what ultimately led me on the path, me personally, and my mother actually, on the path that led us to open spirituality. It wasn't the paranormal. It was that verse in Genesis that is conveniently skipped over. So that was sort of kind of similar in his build. Now, I'm sure a lot of people these days who are into things like cryptozoology would probably say, oh, you probably saw Bigfoot, Wild Man of the Woods, or Bigfoot, what we're now calling Bigfoot. I personally don't think that that was really what it was. He could have been. But if so, then the depictions of Bigfoot are very stereotypical, because all the depictions that I have seen that are supposed to represent anything that's even similar to a Bigfoot didn't really look like what I saw. Those drawings look kind of cartoonish in comparison to what I saw. What I saw was a man, not a man with ape-like features and long hair. Couldn't really tell that he had a lot of body hair, but it didn't look like, he looked like a giant man. That's why I called him a giant. And yeah, he walked with long strides, but then so does an average human who's above average height. So that doesn't really tell you very much. Broad shoulders, yes, but the shoulders that you see on artwork that's supposed to represent Bigfoot, that's not the outline, that's not the silhouette that I saw. Interestingly, however, the closest thing that I have ever seen to the what I call the glassy look, the glassy effect, that's the only way that I can put it. And this really, really startled me, and I'm not sure why I'm getting so emotional when I think of it. If you saw the movie AVP, Alien vs. Predator, the Predator's cloak, the special effect that they did for the Predator's cloak is actually when they're fully cloaked, not when they're coming out, when they're fully cloaked, when they're fully, quote, invisible, unquote. But you can still actually tell that they're there if you pay attention. That was not exactly what I saw, but it was darn close. So close, because I remember when I saw that movie, I was like, I've seen that. Not the exact same thing. It's Hollywoodized. It's, and also they did like a sparkly effect. They do like a sparkly effect. There was no sparkly effect. And this wasn't like somebody who was cloaked per se. This was more like, I don't know. All I can say is that it looked natural, which is a bizarre word to use, I know, but that's the only word that I can think of. It looked natural. There was no sparkly glitter effect. There was no, or what I call the transporter effect from Star Trek, because all that was really just a clear glass of glitter, and they stirred it up and then filmed it whirling around and superimposed that on the image of a person. So that's what I call it the transporter effect. It didn't have the transporter effect. It didn't have the glittery effect. But I compare it to glass because he was transparent. I could see everything that was behind him, and he didn't have a lot of his own color coming through. But also because, if you put a spoon in a glass of water and you look through, you have that refraction. That's the only way that I can think of to describe it. But if you look up clips of that movie, of the predator character or even their weapons when they're completely cloaked, because they're still holding on to him, and as soon as they let him go, you can see him. That's very similar. It's not exact, but it's similar. It's the closest fictional example that I can give of what I saw. I have not seen anything quite like that since leaving that house. Black figures, yes, I have seen those. Not quite the same as in that house, but I have seen black figures before. The black humanoid figures in other places. Even as recently as a few years ago. Outside in the area. But I have not seen or at least I haven't noticed any giants. And really the reason why I thought of this again recently was because I was looking into some of the stories that the cultures that some of my ancestors came from, like with my different native ancestors, including the Cherokee. The Cherokee speak of giants. And a lot of people pass that off, especially nowadays, as, they're just talking about Bigfoot. And yeah, in some cases, they probably are. But not at all. I think that people have a tendency to, number one, a lot of the old stories were blended, conflated. Some of them are more intact, some of them are not. A lot of stories have been lost, not just from the native world, particularly from the native world, but because of, we won't go into it, but really from everybody. Everybody has stories that have been changed, lost, broken up, added to, subtracted from, and I think some of it, they're talking about, quote, Bigfoot, unquote, but also you got a lot that are not. A lot that are talking about something else. Sometimes several something else's. English is a wonderful thing, yeah. So, this is the mild spooky. I did a poll on the channel asking, a poll where people could vote, and asking just how spooky they wanted this spooky special to be. So there were some who wanted a more mysterious, still spooky, but more mysterious special, and then there were quite a few who wanted the spookiest. So that will be the next video. The next video will be the cautionary tale, and you'll find out why I'm starting with the lighter stuff when you hear the other stuff. That is a lot more recent. That happened here. So I hope you enjoyed this special, this spooky special, and that it maybe, if you've experienced something similar to this, you're not crazy. You're more than likely not crazy. Yeah, you're not the only one. I've come across several stories, mainly in books, and a couple others that I found online that I just kind of felt were more, intuitively felt were more genuine, not people seeking attention or people trying to make something out of nothing. But I mean, there are an awful lot of people out there who do have genuine experiences, and I mean, if you were to tell me something happened to you, I wouldn't laugh at you. I wouldn't laugh at you. I wouldn't be incredulous. I might spend some time contemplating exactly what that was, and what maybe even if there was a lesson behind there somewhere, because often I think there are lessons in some of the things of this type, of this nature that we experience or we hear about. For me, I think it was interesting that it happened during the time period of my life that it did, specifically the age that I was, because I was in my early to mid, like between 12 and 14, I think. So we lived there for a few years, not really long time, but a few years, at least 2. So like between the ages of 12 to 14, I would say, or maybe 11 to 14, because it took a while for us to move in. It took a little bit of a while for us to move in because they were still working on the house. Even actually after we moved in, they were still putting the finishing touches on the house, because we had to we could only stay in the previous house for so long. It took us a while to find a new place. But for me, I think it was interesting that it happened around that time, because that was also around the time that certain other things began happening in my life. And I think also it was in the run-up to the age where I could make more informed adult decisions about what path I wanted to go on. So I do find the timing to not be extremely significant, but I am kind of glad that it happened when it did. Also, was I particularly scared of any of that? Actually, no. Which is interesting. Suspicious, yeah. Because you got voices coming out of the vent and voices coming out of a pipe in the yard and a military helicopter hovering over your house. What the heck is that? And we never got answers to any of the things that happened there. And like I said, I'm not going to give any really specific identifying pieces of information, because I don't want to do that. I don't think it's necessary. But this is my true story, one of them. I guess it's kind of a series of stories all about the same place. There were other things, and like I said before in the clip that I sent to Alura, this is not the first time that something like this has happened. It is the first time that something more external, for lack of a better way of saying it, has happened. But there were things that happened when I was younger. There were things I saw. There were things that I heard. There were things that I dreamed, which is a whole other conversation. But yeah, you're not crazy if you're one of the people who've seen something weird, and you feel like you haven't got anybody to talk to. No, that you're not alone. You're not alone. I wouldn't laugh at you. I wouldn't call you crazy. There are things that happen, and it's not all in your head. I don't believe for a second that it was all in my head. If it was, then it was in all three of our heads. Which I don't think is very likely, and it would have had to have been in the trees' heads too. It would have had to be in the wind's heads too. It would have to be in everybody's head, even the heads of folks who haven't necessarily got heads. So yeah, I don't think that I don't automatically, my automatic default is not to believe everything that I see, everything I hear, everything I read from other people. But that doesn't mean that I'm gonna call you crazy or a liar or an attention seeker or anything like that. I don't make assumptions like that. I simply see what's being presented and then draw a conclusion. I try not to cast judgment. I just draw conclusions for my own information, if for nothing else. So I will see you in the next video, which I think it's either going to be spoken word or trying to think of my upload order. It's either going to be spoken word or it's going to be the next spooky tale, the cautionary tale. I'm not going to be doing a book talk video this week. I'll restart that after I get these out. So, have a nice, safe, blessed, spooky season. Enjoy the fall. I hope you have more fall weather than we have.